Good evening. I'm Kim Roberts, the Director of Graduate Studies for the Security Studies program. I would like to welcome you all here tonight to listen to what should be a fascinating discussion. We are embarking on a new era of innovation in warfighting. The world is shifting back to great power competition. How do we know that we are investing in the right technology to secure our future? How do we determine the best use of our resources to maintain military superiority? The one thing we do know is that these challenges must be faced by the combination of government, the private sector, and academia. These communities must work together. We must ensure that the United States and its allies remain at the forefront of technology and innovation. Our moderator for this evening is Chris Taylor, an adjunct professor here at Georgetown who is running the Hacking for Defense seminar. Chris is the CEO of Giovanni, a big data and analytics company. He spent 14 years in the United States Marine Corps. He holds an MBA from the College of William & Mary, and he is also a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School. So I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoy the discussion. Chris, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kim. Good evening. For those of you who've never been here before, you are at Georgetown University, the nation's largest Jesuit and Catholic university. You are sitting in Gaston Hall, the illustrious Gaston Hall, where heads of state have spoken their words. The hall was completed, I believe, in 1901, and we're very grateful that Georgetown has lent it to us this evening. The reason that we're here tonight is this is part of a graduate seminar, as Kim said, called Hacking for Defense. It is the application of lean startup principles to live national security challenges. And in the audience today are the students of the current class. Can I ask them just to stand up real quick so people can ID them? These folks right here, thank you, are working on 5 hard problems across the national security ecosystem. I don't do any of this by myself. My dear friend Catherine Harris, who couldn't be here this evening, co-teaches with me as well. Hacking for Defense is a congressionally funded program through MD5, which is the National Security Technology Accelerator at the Pentagon. It reports up to Undersecretary Griffin's office in R&E. And on the other side of that, the group that helps us procure problems and curate them is the Hacking for Defense Incorporated, and that's run by Alex Gallo, who's here this evening. Put your hand up, Alex, so people can say that. There you go, great. And so the fact that it's congressionally funded should tell you that we're getting a lot out of the program and people are seeing the benefit. As with anything else, it's a very different class than I think many of these students have ever taken at Georgetown, yet they are taking it with great aplomb. They are really, really putting everything into it. One of the very keen things about this year's program is that it is the first time that U.S. graduate students are working on an allies problem. So we have one of our teams who are working on a challenge for the United Kingdom. Claire Burt and Chris Featherstone from the UK Embassy are here this evening. There they are sitting right there. So we have truly gone global. We have American grad students trying to help out with the UK problem, and hopefully, because Hacking for Defense is starting up in the UK at King's College and other places, they might have an opportunity to work on some of our problems as well. So it's a rich program that we're clearly seeing the benefit of. Tonight's topic is innovation in the midst of great power competition, and we have a very esteemed panel to talk about it this evening. To my very far left is former Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work. He's also currently the co-chair of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Sitting to his right is Dr. Sarah Sewall. She's the former Undersecretary of State, and she's currently a senior fellow at In-Q-Tel, one of our finest technology investment programs for national security. To Sarah's right is General Steve Wilson. He is the Vice Chief of Staff for the U.S. Air Force. And if any of you have heard General Wilson speak about innovation or great power competition or anything related to it, you'll know that he's passionate about it, and we're going to try and suss a lot of that out of him this evening as well. And then last but certainly not least, to my left is Ms. Carrie Wibben. She's the Deputy Director of the Defense Security Service, which plays an important role in critical technology protection. And so it's one thing to talk about the things that we innovate, it's another thing to talk about how we protect the things that we've innovated toward. I'll just offer one more thing before we get started. We get some pretty high-level mentors in our class to help people think through some of the problems. We have people here from Project Maven. We have people who have had lifelong careers in both the intelligence and the defense agencies. And my good friend Brian Ware, who's Assistant Secretary at Homeland Security for Cyber Resilience and Infrastructure. Am I close enough? Thank you. So Brian is, prior to taking the job at DHS, was a mentor in the classroom every week with our students over the last few years. So Brian, thank you for making time to come see us this evening. Okay, all the house cleanings stuff is out of the way. Here's the thing. In the title, we talk about innovation. We talk about great power competition. Let's level set the conversation a little bit, and let's talk about, Bob, I'll start with you. What in the heck is great power competition? What is it? What does it mean?
Well, from the Department of Defense's perspective, great powers, we use John Mearsheimer's definition, hard realist, and he defines a great power as a large state that can credibly confront the most powerful state in the world conventionally. Doesn't have to be able to defeat them, but can grievously hurt them, and has a survivable nuclear strike capability. Now, for any international policy wonk, they'll say that's a very narrow definition, but from the Department of Defense, which looks at hard capabilities, it's a perfect definition. So we look at states that really could cause the United States problem if we found ourselves in a conventional confrontation and have a survivable second strike capability. There are only 2 states in the world that fit that definition, and that's Russia and China. We think Russia is a declining great power, China is a rising great power, but both of them meet the definition of a great power.
So let's talk about the context in which all of that great power competition occurs. General Wilson, we hear all the time about this nebulous gray zone. Describe for us what the gray zone is. What happens there? Why? What happens?
I'd say conflicts happening in that gray zone every day, whether I'm probing somebody with cyber, whether, I'll take for a recent example, in the South China Seas, until a few years ago, there was no islands. We flew over there all the time. Today, there's a new island there, and the Chinese say, stay out of my airspace. This is Chinese airspace. It didn't exist till 2 years ago. But now there's this, I set the conditions to say, I own this, when in fact, they don't. But that's happening across, I think, lots of different areas, diplomatically, across information, economically, this pulling and tugging in this gray zone that doesn't rise to conflict, but it's conflict below visible levels.
So it's an interesting, because quite frankly, if we thought about that for a minute, that's everything except firing some sort of weapon. Let's just for that.
Yeah.
Sarah, you as
let me just
please
say that no great power wants to fight a war with another great power, especially when all of them are nuclear armed. So from the Department of Defense's perspective, both China and Russia are conventionally deterred. So how do they confront the United States without triggering overt military operations? So what I would say, what is different about gray zone operations, it is competitive in nature and confrontational with a design to hurt the United States and its allies. So it's there's all sorts of things that go on all the time, but this is planned overt operations, what the Russians would call active measures. The Chinese use much more soft power, economic coercion, and et cetera. So it's not just things that go on every day. It's things that are actually pushing back against the global order that was established by the United States and its allies at the end of World War II.
So let me just tee on that, because I think what's going on today is really there's a fight between two different beliefs, cultures, ways of doing life, right? We would say we believe in openness and transparency and Western liberalism. And there's others who believe in completely opposite. Closed societies, no transparency, opaqueness, and authoritarian governments that say this is the way it will be done. And that's the conflict that's going on between two different, Russia and China versus the United States.
So certainly then, in the course of that less than kinetic operations, Sarah is a diplomat and someone who's responsible for a very large portfolio at state. How do we combat that? Let me ask this. Do we understand gray zone operations, and are we prepared to do what some think is necessary in order to compete in the gray zone?
Well, it's a great question, Chris. You know, I think coming off of the point that Bob just made about the Mearsheimer definition being narrow and the Defense Department thinking about itself, it's thinking about its tools predominantly in military form, I think that tells you a lot about why we have been slow to recognize the competition that we're in. We as Americans, in my judgment, have, over the past few decades, sort of taken our economic dynamism for granted, and we've put almost all our chips on the table of military capability. And what we're now confronted with are adversaries that are saying, hey, that particular form of military capability is not going to be the battlefield on which I want to fight. I'm going to use other means. And so it's this development of other means that, frankly, we used a lot in the earlier phases of the Cold War, but they're all forms of economic suasion. They're appeals to ideology. They're alliances and buying friends and leveraging friends. It's a host of activities to include active measures and things that happen on sort of the split screen where you're moving into a bit of espionage and counterintelligence, but it goes all the way across that. And we've had some experience in our military with moving away from thinking about about a nuclear deterrent and about conventional dominance. And we did that in the context of counterinsurgency, but that was not the direction in which we need to be looking now because, as the general said, our adversaries are taking a much more long-term, subtle, multifaceted approach to get whole of government, very important point, to achieving their objectives without triggering generalized warfare. I think of it, although Clausewitz aficionados would probably have a problem with this, but I think of us as being sort of inherently Clausewitzian and thinking about power in military terms, and the Chinese, of course, are guided by Sun Tzu. And so that is a different gestalt altogether, to mix a whole bunch of cultures in a sentence. And that is something that we're not well equipped for thinking about ideologically in terms of our government organization, in terms of some of the orthodoxies with which we approach concepts of power and influence in the globe today.
So in the course of all of that activity that you describe and how it's being perpetuated, we, in the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, are still trying to innovate new technologies, new doctrine, new everything to try and keep up with this as we sort it out. We're sort of painting the car as we drive it a little bit. In the 20th century, particularly during the Cold War, we had smart people that would invent something fantastic, and we would hide it in a mountain, or we would hide it in a desert, and nobody would find out about it. But that's not the case here in the 21st century. And Carrie, your job, certainly your old job, and now certainly your new job, really dealt with critical technology protection. So all the stuff that we're innovating, and we'll talk about a lot of that tonight, how are we protecting it? What are we protecting it? Is industry protecting its stuff? Is government protecting its stuff? And if not, how do we protect our stuff?
Yeah, no, this is obviously something I'm very passionate about, and you and I have spent a lot of time talking about, Chris. But the reality is, you know, the national defense strategy, national military strategy, national security strategy, they all turn on the United States' ability to out-innovate our adversaries. I would say at the macro level, what we're missing is a comparable strategy to secure that innovation. I don't think that exists, at least I certainly don't think it exists in DoD. But the good news is the conversation is happening now, and it's happening at the highest levels. How do we secure that innovation? How do we secure our technology, critical technologies that the department is investing in? There's many different ideas and thoughts out there. I think the one that's starting to pick up momentum in the building anyway, and I say the building, the Pentagon, is this concept of integrating, so everyone's probably familiar with the acquisition process to some degree, cost, schedule, performance are the three main pillars of acquisition. The fourth pillar that we're trying to promote is security, a fourth pillar of security. Not a pillar to be traded away, because you never award based on all three, or in this case, all four, but something that is absolutely fundamental and baked into the way we do acquisition as a Department of Defense. And that's a really good start. And I think if you talk to Undersecretary Lord, Ellen Lord, or Undersecretary Kernan, you hear them talk about this now. We've testified to it multiple times. Security is a fourth pillar. Easier said than done, right? That is a major sea change in terms of how the department has historically conducted the business of acquisition. The reality is that's really just the first step. But it has to start, I think, there. And then we need to think about what incentive does that actually drive in industry? And I think there's a lot of things to consider from that standpoint, including, how do we drive the right incentives? How do we establish the right incentives? Insurance incentives, right? If they are not operating at what we call an appropriate state of care, there's a potential liability risk there. So how do we create insurance incentives? How do we create tax incentives to get industry to prioritize and focus on and invest in security as opposed to seeing it as an overhead cost to be minimized, which is kind of how it's treated today. How do we, for small businesses, what are they interested in? Something we've heard from them is maybe, interest-free loans to actually start to build their security programs, because the reality is even a very sophisticated cyber sensor, right, if you're going to deploy one of those on your networks, they're very expensive, and the small companies can't afford to do that. They can't afford to invest in, a robust cybersecurity program. So those are some of the ideas. There's actually a report that we published last fall, I believe. It was called Deliver on Compromise, and it's on MITRE's website. But we partnered with MITRE to roll out this overarching construct and proposal for the department to consider. Actually incorporating security as the fourth pillar is really the main recommendation. But I recommend it for any of you to read. Happy to send the link to you, Chris, if you haven't read it.
Thank you.
Chris?
Sure.
Before we lose the thought on gray zone competition,
sure,
I just want to say, look, we do not want the Department of Defense being the leader in gray zone competition. The Department of Defense should be in a supporting role. This should be led by either the Department of State or some kind of intergovernmental organization, in my mind, kind of organized along the lines of the Office of Strategic Services, which would be an amalgamation of Title 10 Department of Defense authorities, Title 50 Intelligence Community authorities, and Department of State. We were really, really good at gray zone activities in the Cold War. It's just that we've allowed ourselves to let them all lapse. We have to build that capability back up, but I would say where we should start is in the Department of State. And the Department of Defense should be in a supporting role with its special operations forces and all of its ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, et cetera. So I didn't want to lose that.
No, it's a good point. So, sir, let me just ask you then, based on what Bob just said, look, we have the National Security Act of 1947. Is it time for us to have a National Security Act of 2019 or 2020? And to get to where you have just described, sir?
Maybe it is.
Sounding yes for me.
Let me bridge this, because if I were to ask the crowd here about great power competition or gray zone activities, would most of your families know what we're talking about? And I would argue no, right? That's part of this. We've lost the thinking about it. I don't think America understands this word competition, whole of government competition that's going to impact all of us, whether it be a state, whether it be military, economically. This competition that's in our face, I tell my folks, I use my family as data points. And I go, when I ask them about it, they're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, do you not see what's happening globally? And we talk about this existential disruption. It's happening politically, economically, socially, and technologically. The tech is flaming a lot of this, but it has an ability to change our nation as we know it. Right? And that's the fight we're in, and we need to be able to understand that fight. And I use it as a 1 point, I call it a 15-to-1. So hear me out for 10 seconds. Economies of China and the US are comparable in size. Our growth rate was 3%, and we were actually, that was good. And China's last year was 6.7%, and they were disappointed. Right? 4-to-1 population, 8-to-1 the number of STEM graduates that they produce every year that we produce. Now, fast forward a decade under those dynamics and say, what will that mean? Do people understand that's the competition? And then I'm going to put on top of that a cultural aspect that I don't care where the good idea came from. I'm going to steal it from you, change it, morph it, and make it mine. Right? And so that, as long as everybody's aware that that's a competitor out there, and that's who we're going to be dealing with across this whole gray zone activity in this competition.
I think part of that, though, is we need to.
That's a very warm thought. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
That wasn't sunshine. You were supposed to be sunny. Supposed to be sunshine. So I think part of the challenge, though, is I think we need to look at ourselves a little bit in terms of our responsibility to get that message out there. It's the awareness. It's the education, right? We in the counterintelligence world, right? We prosecute cases and put people in jail for economic espionage all day long. But you know what we don't do? We don't talk about it. We don't publish those cases. We don't kind of get the messaging out there. We don't have nearly enough of focus on hardening the targets, whether it be academia, corporate America, small businesses, large businesses. We don't get out there and do a good job of educating on the threat, educating on what are China's tactics? What are the threat vectors? How do they acquire our technology and our innovation? How do they very successfully, and sometimes 5 different ways at once, target a specific technology until they get it, whether it be joint venture, front company, economic espionage, research partnerships, academic solicitation, right? We have case studies where we have, strategically, kind of to your point, sir, come together as a whole of government, which we're finally doing, at least in the counterintelligence and law enforcement space, to leverage the 34 agencies and all of the respective authorities that we bring together in this national level task force. And we're finally now getting to a point where working with DOJ, working with the White House, we're able to put out products to actually drive that level of awareness and education. I don't think, this is sort of the Google moving away from Dragonfly. I don't think if the message was out there and there was a level of awareness that we need, that there wouldn't be a greater call to action.
Oh, okay. But Sarah, if a week ago or 2 weeks ago, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs has to invite the CEO of Google to come in to have a discussion about what Google is doing in China is detrimental to U.S. national security, I don't think we're anywhere near what Carrie just described. Help me think through that.
Well, I will come back to that in a second, but I want to make a slight caveat, which is to say that, so there's competition, and then there's something approaching irregular warfare, right?
Sure.
And they're really different things. And so sometimes in the conversation, we fail to disaggregate them. So economic competition has been a fact of life forever, and that continues. Now, we don't like it when people do illegal things like steal secrets. We also don't like it when people do really sneaky things that have the potential to compromise our entire domestic infrastructure, like put little chips on things that we don't know about in our purchases. So I think when we talk about what our competitors are doing, we have to be clear that what's worrisome is when Russia interferes in our election. What's worrisome is when China does things that are illegal and surreptitious and break norms and laws. But let's be honest, a lot of what we're concerned about are, as Carrie, I think, was alluding to, acts of omission on our part.
Sure.
Right? We're not being smart. We're not being smart about how we allow economic choices to impact our technologies at home. We're not being smart about how we allow incentives to lure our talent away. I would argue we're not being very smart about how we lure talent to the US in terms of the visas and immigration piece. But we're not being smart about rules that we set up in many cases, where we could do better by our own rules to protect ourselves, and the other guys are just exploiting those rules. So there's a continuum of competitive activity that goes from truly nefarious and frightening and of a potential existential threat, and things that are economic competition, and sometimes they overlap,
Sure.
right? Which is what's really tricky about galvanizing the will to address them. Because our cyber vulnerabilities or our supply chain vulnerabilities could be the precursor to basically taking the lights out and a full-scale, conventional vulnerability, and yet they're also economic competition. So it's a really complicated set of issues that I just wanted to try to unpack. On your question,
I'm sorry.
On your question about the reorganizing government, I think we've been not able to work as a unified government for a very long time as we've grown, as we've become more specialized, as agencies become more autonomous. This challenge about responding is as much about government coming together as it is about political will on the outside. So that's another level of vulnerability that's self-imposed on our own part. So now I've forgotten what your original question was.
No, it's fine.
I'll pitch into this because I went and asked, we talked about this before, and I went and asked one of our major tech firms this specific question. I said, are you a multinational company who happens to be based in the United States, or a US company that does global business? Right. And the answer was, that in this case, they said, we made it absolutely crystal clear. We are a US company that does global business. That we realized that if we were to open up our source code to China, for example, they said we would be speaking a foreign language and our headquarters would move. There's no doubt about that. And so we will not allow that to happen.
And to pick up on what Sarah said, if you read the National Security Strategy or the National Defense Strategy, you will never see the word adversary. You will see the word strategic competitor, sometimes geopolitical rival. That gets to the competition between authoritarian liberal capitalism and open democracy. So that's the geopolitical rivalry stuff. But we generally refer to China and Russia as strategic competitors. And they are aggressively pursuing their own national interests. Sometimes it bumps up against our own, and we don't like it. And Chris Ford, who's an Assistant Secretary of State at their Bureau for International Affairs and Non-Proliferation, just gave a speech on March 14th. It's on the web. I'd recommend it. And he said what the United States, and this gets to what we're talking about, says what the United States has lost is the competitive mindset that we had in the Cold War. We recognize we're in a long-term strategic competition. And from a historical perspective, the United States is pretty good at that once it kind of says, hey, we're in a competition. When I was the Undersecretary of Navy in 2009, in the first Obama administration, I could not use the word China in competition. I was prohibited from using the word China in competition in the same paragraph because at that time we were trying to convince ourselves that we would coax China in to become a responsible stakeholder of the international community. By the end of the Obama administration, the president and the national security team all recognized, hey, China is a competitor, and we need to treat them like a competitor, and Russia is definitely a competitor. So we're not talking about making these states adversaries. We're talking about competing to make sure that our own national interests are pursued vigorously and we protect our way of life.
Can I put something? It's a long-term battle of beliefs. Here's the deal, but we can lose. Right. So this takes a whole nation effort for us, all of us, to understand that and to compete.
I think that's right. I think it will take, but it's still, until there's an awareness, right? 9/11, we had smoking craters. That was a kinetic attack, right? It was what got us, everyone, the whole nation focused at a level that, I don't think a lot of us had ever seen in our lifetimes.
But we don't want to have to wait for a bunch of 9/11s
that's right.
to galvanize ourselves for great power competition.
I think we're in the war before the war, right? But how do we actually get the nation to recognize that this is every bit as serious and a threat to our national and economic security?
It's a much more profound threat
than 9/11. I would say
we did
way
this
more.
before. I'll use an example. Look what happened in the early 60s, late 50s. As a matter of fact, tomorrow will be the 60th anniversary is when they came out and said, here is the Mercury 7 astronauts. We got in a space race with the Soviet Union, right? On May 25th, 1961, President Kennedy said, we're going to go to the moon and back in this race against the Soviets, right? We were behind. They beat us to space first. We were a year in trail, right? In over 8 years, we did 36 space launches. We had some horrific failures, right? We lost astronauts in Apollo 1, but we went through the Mercury, the Gemini, and the Apollo programs, and we got to the moon and back. But it was a whole of nation, everybody was in. It spun off all kinds of technology that allowed us to leap forward for 20 years based on that push by this whole of nation effort to compete.
So why do you think Russian interference in a domestic election was not the same shock to the system?
It should have been.
Well, if I turn on TV and I turn on Vice or I turn on 60 Minutes, inevitably every 2 or 3 weeks, I see one of the segments that's on AI. What the Chinese are doing with AI, what we hope to do with AI. Bob, you're the co-chair of the National Security AI Commission on Artificial Intelligence. I want to make sure I get it right. And I think I just read that we're putting forth $1 billion in the AI effort. Is $1 billion going to get us there, or how do I win that competition? If the competition is important as we say, how am I getting there with $1 billion?
Well, let me preface this by saying in 2014, we were wrestling with, we saw the technological challenges facing us by China and to a lesser extent Russia. And we're in this period of a technological tsunami. It provides all of the ingredients for what military theorists call a military technical revolution or a revolution in military affairs. All of the ingredients are there. So we asked the Defense Science Board, of all of the things out there, I'd get a brief as a deputy secretary. A person would come in on 5G. My God, 5G, if you lose 5G, you lose the fight. Oh, well, that sounds pretty important. And then the next day I'd get someone come in and say, if you lose quantum, man, you're dead. And I go, oh, okay. And then AI, genomics, you name it, synthetic biology. We asked the Defense Science Board, we said, what is the one technical competition we must win? And they said, it's not even close. It's AI, artificial intelligence, and the autonomous operations that AI will allow. That is the key because it has such an impact across the United States. Military, in all aspects of it. Operations, logistics, business, you name it. I'd also recommend, and since that time, it is widely viewed, I believe, that AI is leading to a fourth industrial revolution. So all of the indicators are that AI are the keys to economic and military competitiveness in the 21st century. And the Chinese believe that wholly. As a whole of government, they've gone all in. They have a national AI plan. Here's what it says. We want to catch the United States in AI by 2020. We want to surpass the United States in AI by 2025. And we want to be the world leader in AI by 2030. And that will allow us to increase our economy by a minimum of 26%, to Sevi's point. They're already moving quite fast. They've surpassed us in purchase power parity. Unless something happens, we expect them to exceed our GDP in absolute terms in the late 20s. So the Chinese are all in on this competition. Is $1 billion a year? It's a laugh. It's not even worth, well, it is worth something. But the new AI strategy out of the White House essentially is a call to arms. The National Security Commission for AI is a congressional attempt. How do we galvanize the whole government and public-private partnerships and commercial so that we can lead in these technologies? And so we're starting to build the foundation, but we got a long way to go.
Okay, I can jump in on that because you, again, said some really important things if you paid attention. This whole government effort. So it's not industry, it's not academia, it's not their Defense Department, it's not their national labs. Draw a big circle around all of it, and all of it are all in to win. And in fact, they're required to in China. All of the information goes to the Chinese government, to the Communist Party. Right? And so I call that, they've set their strategic goal and they've been hitting all their milestones. And so, again, that's part of this competition that we're talking about. But it's not an individual company. It's not Alibaba or Tencent or Beidou. Yes, they're in. It's all of it in to win. And the other part that comes around it is what it's doing. It's inspiring a generation of Chinese to believe that they can win. And there's been lots of recent efforts where we've seen that happen, right? They just landed on the dark side of the moon, right? And that's a big deal. We landed on Mars, a rover, 20 years ago, right? But told in China, we're the first to do this. Nobody can compete with us. We beat the United States, just like we beat them in putting a quantum satellite in orbit. We can win, and it's inspiring a generation. So that's a competition.
I think the key, though, is, $1 billion, $5 billion, whatever it is, unless we get serious about upfront, before we award these contracts, looking at these companies and the supply chains through a security and counterintelligence lens, we might as well write that check to China.
Sure.
I'm not joking. This is
No. I think that's right. This is what
we talk about. Oh, is it enough investment? None of it matters unless we're actually doing the right things from a security and counterintelligence standpoint up front in the process. You might as well just write the check to them.
Well,
we are funding their R&D program for AI right now, right? So.
I think the interesting point that you're making is that if you listen to everything that everybody said thus far, we're asking questions, we're talking amongst each other, but it's the convergence of all of these things at various levels, at different times, at the worst possible opportune time, et cetera, that causes us the greatest challenges. And I think that really goes to the OSS-like organization that you were talking about before, Bob, that's necessary to see the entire board, which perhaps we don't have enough wood on it to see the entire board, and therefore fund the entire board when it's necessary. Go ahead.
We could do so much more now, though. I mean, there are things that one can do in the interim that don't require reorganizing our entire government. And I'd love to see our government work as a unified whole. But, everybody's strength is a weakness if you don't understand it and adapt. And, we have relied on the private sector, hands off, to basically be our source of innovation for a very long time, and just figured we could pluck on the end of it and we'd have time and it would feed us what we needed. And it's interesting because now, there's so much of a convergence between what's important for economic development versus what's important for military advantage. But if you are a private sector company, this is like blaming the wolf for eating the rabbit. The private sector company wants to sell things. It doesn't necessarily think of itself as American first. The Chinese market is huge. It needs funding in the short term, so it'll take Chinese money. It wants, a partnership with academic researchers want people to fund their research, so if they get offered a better lab in one of these new cities in China that has $1 gazillion and the shiny new facilities, they'll go there. So the pieces that we have that we've relied on, academia, private sector, they're doing their thing. And unless government, and we have to talk about the role of government in a world in which our discourse is so polarized that when you talk about the role of government, you risk being labeled a crazy socialist. But the role of government, which was critical in helping us win the Cold War, is absolutely important for resetting the table with the private sector and with the universities in order to create these partnerships. You don't even need to reorganize yourself as a government to be able to incentivize things differently, but you do need to have an informed discourse about where those vulnerabilities are, which seams the competitors are exploiting that are perfectly legal, and how to close them. And it's a really multifaceted problem, and it involves conversations between commerce and treasury and state and everybody else in the national security community. And it's very hard to structure those conversations because we're not talking about the big threat out there. Everybody's thinking about their piece of the pie inside. So even for tactical decision making, we're broken. So before we even think about reorganizing, which I'd love to see, we need a consensus on what the problem is so that we can incentivize people to make compromises within our government about how to deal with the actors outside of government and create a different set of incentives for doing the right thing by the national interest.
And I need to pull on the comment on, we're funding their AI. There's a meme that, look, China is behind us technologically, So they steal our IP, which they certainly do. It's been incredibly easy for them to do so up to this point in time. And they copy, that we are better innovators than the Chinese. If we keep that in our competitive mindset, the Chinese will blow us out of the water. Yes. They have already, they are the best coders in the world. They always come in 1 or 2 in coding competitions. They're the best gamers in the world.
They're publishing more academic papers
They publish
now?
more academic papers. Look, this Vice President Pence was going to give 3 speeches about China. The first one was at the Hudson Institute, I think, and he described China as a competitor. We really have to think of them as a competitor. Second one was at APEC, and he gave the U.S. vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific region. The third one he was supposed to give at Munich Security, and he was going to say, this competition is different than the Cold War, and he was going to refer to it as competition against a high-tech authoritarian power, something we've never dealt with, one that can hang with us in the technological space. That got stepped on because of Prime Minister Merkel's speech, et cetera, just got kind of stepped on. But the Chinese truly are in it to win it. There are several, the senior leaders say, we will not tolerate a technological hegemon. We will not tolerate it. We will do everything we can to prevent that from happening. And who are they talking about? They're talking about the United States. So the only thing is, I agree, they are stealing stuff like crazy because it's easy to do. It helps them. But man, those guys are good. Eric Schmidt went to the AlphaGo competition thinking that maybe we were 5 years ahead in AI. He came back and said, if we're 6 months ahead, we're lucky. They're closing fast. So we cannot think of China as just a knockoff, a copier, an integrator of stuff that they steal. They're quite good.
So I use the example of WeChat. First of all, I go to places and most people hadn't heard of WeChat. And I said, yeah, 1/3 of the world uses that app. And so my summation is they stole all of our apps and combined it and put it into one app, modified it for China. So I can Skype, I can Yelp, I can Uber, I can Facebook, I can pay bills all inside of one app, of which the Chinese government gets all the data. Right? And so when you look at something like 58 billion transactions that happen a day on WeChat, it gives they're phenomenal at it. So they stole some ideas, put them together, made it Chinese for them, and worked it in their and it's.
Well, just let me say, we're going to open this up for questions to the audience. So if you want to start, those of you with questions, if you want to line up, feel free. And you should have lots after this conversation. Sarah, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, another example based on the point that you just made, General, is how we think about data. I would say that the new AI strategy is a lot of hat and not a lot of cattle, but the one thing they did say is there's going to be a commitment to try to free up federal data. That's really important. But where's most data held? It's held by private companies. If data is the new oil in terms of fueling AI acceleration, and the Chinese government has got the scale at which it's collecting on its citizens, no permissions needed, we've got a real data deficit issue. And we could address that in a variety of ways. We could deal with privacy issues so that we could incentivize greater sharing of data. We could focus on creating synthetic data and thinking about hybrids so you could use smaller models. But we have a strategic petroleum reserve. Why aren't we working on a data reserve that can be an accelerant, right? So there are a lot of things that we can do in the shorter term that aren't even on our agenda. And meanwhile, our main competitor has a very long-term view in which it's almost the inverse in terms of values and structures that we have, and it's exploiting everything along those lines.
I think one of the things, so if you listen to this conversation, one of the things, the first thing I want to say is we need a clarion call, except it would be a clarion call in a haystack full of clarion calls. How do we differentiate the true need of what we need to do amongst all of the tweets and all of the news stories and about everything else? We've got to find a way to get this particular whole of nation approach into the water stream now and loudly, or we're just going to be one more hashtag
So one idea
we're losing.
is to use a Pentagon technique, which is called wargaming, but just do it as a scenario building and build out the scenario in which we continue to do what we're doing and show what they do and extrapolate, and then describe that world and what it would mean for the average American.
Right. I think
Carrie, and then we're going to go to questions. Go
yeah,
ahead.
a couple ideas. So I mentioned that we don't do a good job of just even putting information out there, right? That actually shows China's playbook, right? So we have embedded counterintelligence in Defense Innovation Unit out in Silicon Valley. And all they do all day long is they go with the team out to talk to these companies, and they educate them, right? To say, okay, we'll give you $100,000, but that means you can't take China's $200,000 at the same time. And by the way, if you do that, you're probably out of business in 3 years. And here's 4 examples of where that's happened, right? So, I mean, it's integrating and getting to, it is a bit of a more tactical approach, right? But we're embedding and we're getting the message out there. We have products now. The FBI just put out, and this is this joint task force I mentioned, a China threat to academia, China threat to corporate America, China cyber threat to US businesses, and about 12 case studies where we've gotten to prosecution, right, all unclassified. So I'll send you the link. I would love for all of you to look at those, read those, and then start distributing those to whoever you think would be interested, right? The FBI's never done that before. This is the first time they've produced these unclassified products that we actually can share, talk about, and increase the awareness.
Chris, I was going to jump on the same thing. I look in this room full of really bright, talented folks from lots of disciplines here. We have to start telling the story. Right? There's an education piece, a big education piece, but it starts with your families. It starts your circle of friends, your business acquaintances, telling that story that we just heard.
And
yes,
leveraging that Hacking for Defense network, right? You guys are spreading like wildfire, right? And so
we are. I think
it's a vehicle.
I think it's, and I'm glad to hear both of you say that. I won't point them out, but at least 3 students in this class who had never worked on national security problems have sent emails and said, can I have some one-on-one time to sit down and talk about, I really am now hooked on working on these hard problems for the nation. How can I be more involved? Which is testament to the testament to the strength of the Hacking for Defense approach. But thank you for saying that, because the long term is going to, we're not all going to be here for the long term. The long term is going to require a whole bunch of people to come after us to work on these really tough problems. So thank you for saying that. Blake Pennington.
So first off, thank you all very much for being here. It's great hearing each of your unique perspectives. My question was kind of actually on that last topic, so I'll kind of go with it here a little bit. But I know the picture that's been painted is, when we look at our competitors, they've got more human capital, they're spending more money, and they've got government regulatory support to accelerate each of those causes. And using our class as an example, I think we have 1, maybe 2 STEM graduates in the class. So there's this clear competition between private and public sector. So how do we compete with this picture that's been painted, and what are our next steps?
Ideas and beliefs, right? So I look around the room and see some really talented, smart people who have individual ideas of which they can make a difference, right? The society that we just talked about with China, it's not done that way, right? And so I think this is really as Secretary of Work started out, this long-term battle of culture and beliefs, and we have to choose. What's that going to be? Is it going to be a closed, authoritarian society? Or is it going to be this Western liberalism, open, transparent ideals that individuals matter? And that's our long term. That's how we're going to win.
Right? You gotta kind of
Pick
pick a
one.
side.
But there's so many things we could do. I mean, when Sputnik went up, the government established a special schedule. It was called Schedule G. Secretary of Defense Ash Carter would always explain. He was a physicist, and he came into the government under this special Schedule G, which had easier hiring authorities, et cetera. We could easily have a Schedule L and bring in all sorts of different STEM students into the government service. We could have a national AI reserve corps. We'd pay full ride for anybody who would go and get a 4-year degree in computational thinking, coding, algorithm development, applications. When they got out of college, they could go and work in Google and Apple and Facebook, but 2 days a month, they'd go to a military unit and they would say, how can we use AI to help you solve your mission? And 14 days out of the year, they'd go to a major exercise and say, how can we help you automate your operations better? There are just so many things we could do if we said we want to win the battle for talent. It's just right now. I'm on an AI task force at CNAS also, the Center for New American Security. And Andrew Moore from Carnegie Mellon, now at Google, he said every single student who graduates in an AI-related field, we're tapped out. Every single one of them, it's full employment. They can get a job. There isn't anything left. It's to the point where people are recommending to start up AI companies. They shouldn't start now because the battle for talent is so incredibly tough. So the United States has to fill up the whole reservoir so that both our commercial companies and our government and our military has the talent we need to compete.
I'd argue in the national security arena, that's what we compete on. We can do things that nobody else can. It's about purpose and mission. So I've used a defense digital service. So I've just talked to Chris Lynch before. I'm like, how do you get this amazing talent? He goes, you know what? Because they can come to there and we can do stuff that nobody else can do. We give them a security clearance, we put them to work. It's impactful, important, meaningful work. They may only do it for a couple of years. They may do it, and I go, what we want to do is if they leave us, we want to make it really easy for them to come back or to use secretary's work. A couple of days a month to come work for us, but you'll be able to do stuff in the government that you won't be able to do anywhere else.
Because we can't pay what Apple and Google and Facebook will pay, right?
But it's good enough.
But it's really
it's
rewarding
good
work.
enough pay, and it's the importance of the work.
It's good enough pay.
It's in the importance
We'll
of the
pay
work.
for that weekend.
It's the importance of the work, and so what you do matters, and it really adds value to the security of our nation. And that purpose is what's going to, I think, allow us to compete.
Thanks, Blake. Next, please.
Hey, Chris, Tony Porter, good to see you again. How are you? Yeah, you got a world-class group up there. Brian, hi, how are you? I finished up a few months ago a 6-month study sponsored by the ODNI on emerging technologies and national security. We made a couple observations. One is in conversations like this, folks tend to over-index on the national security aspect of innovation and not really focus on the financial incentives at play. Capital markets financially incentivize innovation. Private equity financially incentivizes innovation, as does venture capital. And this is how it plays out. If you stand up a technology company and you're GovCon focused and you go to sell that company to, let's say, through Houlihan Lokey, who does a lot of brokering, the multiple which goes against the valuation is on the bottom line, is on the EBITDA, okay? Let's say you stand up a technology company, same technology, and you focus it in the commercial market, and you go to sell that company, the multiple is on the top line, it's on the revenue, right, to include a lot of the forward forecasting depending upon what market you're in. So from the jump, there's a financial incentive for you to stay into the commercial market. We had an opportunity to go up to MIT and talk to some of the AI folks up there. And this is factoring prominently in their decision-making process. It's why the most cutting-edge MIT folks, AI folks, are focusing on enhancing the emoji that goes over your face as part of an app more so than they're helping Director Cardillo at NGA perfect a geospatial tool. So how does that further play out? If there's a financial incentive at play. The Economist about 4 months ago had a great article about...
I want to help, I want to keep growing, but we got to get a question in here.
Yeah, sure, sorry, Chris.
Thank you.
Okay, the long and short of it is this, and here's the question. China has no pretense of limited government and is using their sovereign wealth fund in the trillions through intermediaries and state-owned enterprises to buy companies with technologies that matter at 5 to 6 times market value. We have In-Q-Tel that is orders of magnitude smaller than that, as you know that. And part of their operating agreement is not to take a lot of risk there because you have to be commercially generating. Do you have any ideas on what a potential alternative scenario to In-Q-Tel would look like?
You don't need an alternative. You've got In-Q-Tel.
Oh, here we go. Here we go.
Adapt In-Q-Tel.
Some
So your
here.
point is well taken, which is that right now In-Q-Tel is primarily focused on customer immediate delivery customer adaptation of existing commercial enterprise efforts, right? So it's not asking them to forego the commercial market, it's asking them to adapt to meet national security needs, but those tend to be more immediate, more short-term needs. There's no reason why the US government, using an existing vehicle or creating a new one, can't think in a more strategic way about its investments. So, for example, the illustration of the early stage academic market, where they don't even have a management team, but the Chinese will swoop in and buy them up and then move them, perhaps, taking all the intellectual capital out. That's something that our venture community doesn't right now want to invest in. We as a nation could choose to invest in that. There are all kinds of ways you can invest in terms of straight investment. You can invest in terms of asking for a partial return. You can do things that get at the seams that venture misses. Similarly, on the large scale side where you need big money, that's often where the Chinese will come in, and they'll essentially manage to take, this is what I think is referenced earlier in terms of some of our dollars, early money that was either academic or early investment, and that was American, and basically turn it into a Chinese investment. There's no reason why we can't think of vehicles to fill that gap in the venture market. So we've got a handful of existing entities that actually understand and are staffed by people who come from the private sector, come from the venture world, who understand the motivations at play in companies. And they are perfectly well equipped to adapt. What they need is a different mandate. Back to our earlier discussion about how do we see the problem, and can we get the political consensus to allow us to
I'll just offer, sorry, sir, I'll just offer that two things. One is, even if we adopted everything you just said, we still need a minimum amount of coverage in order to see all the things that are important to us that are being discovered here in order to put that application to it. We need more coverage of the technology that's being discovered. I would also offer that I've had just about this, I'm very passionate about this particular problem, that maybe we put together a fund made up of the very largest hedge fund managers who will actually hold investments through A, B, C, and nurture the investments all the way through and sort of trying to unload them on our very hardest problems so that they actually get the money and don't suffer valleys of death because they're working on a problem that the US government says, if you solve that, there's a multi-billion-dollar contract that we need. There's different ways to approach it. Anyway, I just want to put that out there.
But sometimes it's just even protecting things that are commercial. Sometimes it's not even, again, I think we're thinking very narrowly DoD. Sometimes it actually is about delivering capability to the government. Sometimes it's just about making sure that the fruits of our intellectual investment and our innovation stay in the United States and aren't shielded from us.
Of course.
Because we want it to bleed into the economic side
Of course.
too.
Thank you. Abe.
Hi. My name is Abraham. I'm part of the Hacking for Defense course. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure there's not a single person here who didn't learn something from your insightful thoughts and the way that you discuss this issue. So thank you so much. My question kind of comes out of 4 thoughts that you all shared, 3 of which were explicit and 1 which was implicit. So you all mentioned that there is kind of a military revolution related to artificial intelligence, that we need a whole government approach, and that there's a talent deficit. But implicitly, you all, anytime that you mention education, you talk about universities or graduates or people that we need, people who are almost already qualified to work on these issues becoming then influenced or inspired to work for the government. So I was wondering, I've worked on issues related to artificial intelligence, and I can promise you without a strong pre-K, elementary, middle, and high school education, I would never have been able to work on these sorts of issues. So I was wondering to what extent the organizations that you support have thought about and, improving early education, especially public education in this country, and what efforts you all are engaged in.
Andrew Moore again, at Carnegie Mellon, he said something that really was surprising and resonated with me. He said, look, all of the data shows that if you could get to our young kids in the 8th grade and teach what he referred to as computational thinking, and then have an advanced computational thinking in the 11th or 12th grade, he said that would be enough to seed a lot of advancement because he shows that in the graduate and undergraduate computer science degrees and all of that, people with these that understand the problem that they want to solve and have computational thinking have turned out to be among the most innovative problem solvers in AI. So that means that it's within reach without us blowing the bank. In other words, if there was a Department of Education requirement that said you will teach computational thinking in 8th grade and you will teach advanced computational thinking in 11th or 12th, everybody has to take it, then that provides the feeder population for a lot of different things. So he's the expert. This is one of the things that the National Security Commission, the previous question, how do we approach the financial competition and how do we approach the war for talent? This is something we're really focused on. We have 2 years to do it.
I think I mean, depending on the state, the county, right, there are programs, certainly, I have a 7-year-old and an 11-year-old, and they take STEAM, I think they call it STEAM now. There's an A in there. They have these programs, at least in Fairfax County, where we are, integrated into the school system, public school. I don't think, where I grew up in Iowa, I could say the same thing, but kind of the roots are there, and I think it's just making sure that we are working probably with the Department of Education, with the state, and making sure that these programs are funded appropriately, because I can see how very quickly when, our county public school systems are always resource constrained and they have to make a choice of what program to cut, what program to fund, to give teachers raises or not, right? These things quickly are the first to go. So I think we just got to look at the incentives, and I think there does need to be some national level call to prioritize this.
Thanks, Abe.
Hi, my name's Nathan Smith. I'm also a student in the Hacking for Defense course. Thank you all for being here. This has been a great conversation. My question is directed at everyone on the panel, so feel free to chime in. Diversity is certainly a huge strength of the United States. I'm wondering what strategies specifically the U.S. government or private realm can do to leverage our unique diversity across the nation.
I would say it has to be in every discussion, in every group. I look at this group in front of us tonight, and I think there's an amazing set of talent here that comes from, as I talked to some folks tonight, literally comes from California to New York and every place in between. And so this diversity of thought and thinking and upbringing and experiences are really important. And I've seen organizations that did not succeed because everybody was the same. They went to the same training and the same education, they thought the same, and it's a recipe for failure. So I completely agree that this diversity is the thing that's going to allow us to win in a competition. This diversity of thought, and again, at all levels, we have to encourage that and actively encourage that and seek it out.
And this goes back to Sarah's comment. We got to get our immigration policy straight. There's an awful lot of talent, STEM talent, that wants to come to the United States, and they can't for whatever reason. And it is making us economically non-competitive. So we really have to figure it out. Easier said than done, obviously.
And I love the idea of some kind of a reserve capacity, because when you think about how out of reach college is for so many, and you think about wanting to recruit talent across all socioeconomic and other dimensions, then something equivalent to a national, bill that entailed a commitment that followed, that made that opportunity more widely available, is certainly an important way to take advantage of diversity if we were to do it.
Thanks, Nathan.
Good evening. I'm Vern Wendt. I am an adjunct professor here for the School of Foreign Service. I also work at the National Defense University. So my question is going to go back to when you were talking about this call to arms and this, being able to get this message out to everyone. So I heard a lot of really good, interesting information, but the thing that I didn't hear was about the one thing that seems to be holding us back, and that's the intel gain loss. the fact, and you did kind of mention it a little bit when you talked about, well, hey, guess what? FBI's put stuff out unclassified. And then in general, you talked about, hey, you can come and work on really cool stuff because we're going to give you a security clearance, you know? And so this idea of we really are gathering really good information on the intel side, but we don't want to give it out to the rest of the world because, and so I use Huawei as an example. You know, we want to tell the world, don't buy Huawei because the Chinese are going to do bad things with that network. But we're not convincing the world that that's the case.
We haven't offered an alternative.
We
haven't offered an alternative.
Correct, yeah. So I'm curious, like, how would you approach an alternative to that? Or how do you approach this gain-loss problem set that we have? Because I think we have to consider that in the whole of government approach.
I normally don't answer a question, but I will. I think part of the challenge is we have to understand and level set what the definition is. So why are we concerned about Huawei? Is it because of infrastructure or is it because of standard setting? And what is more important to us as we think through the problems that we see in all of this? It could be a little bit of both. It could be a lot of one and a little bit of another. But those, I think we have to level set what the actual challenge is, and that sometimes gets confused in the reporting and in the speech making about this particular issue.
Is though, that's like one example. My bigger question is, how do we address that in this whole of government approach? Because I think that is a big elephant in the room that we don't quite address all the time when we say, well, we want to be innovative and we want to do this and we want to do that and we don't want to do things with China because, you know, they're going to take our stuff. But we don't quite tell the whole story because we don't want to lose the value of what we get with intelligence. So is there a way that you can think about addressing that? So.
Yeah, I mean, you summarized it very well. So sitting kind of where I sit in the DoD world and the intelligence community world, you know, I can tell you it's something we struggle with at my agency every day, you know, but we have taken steps to get the threat information out there, right? We can't beat industry up or academia up for not protecting, you know, sensitive information or technologies. If we're not, the threat information is, we have that, right? And they don't. So we have to be telling them, here's the threat. So they even know, you know, how they're being targeted and why they're being targeted and who's targeting them and, you know, what the techniques are. So, I mean, I'm not answering your question very well. I can tell you it's something, I don't know that there is an answer. We struggle with this every day in the intelligence community. It's how much to push down, right, at what risk to get the awareness and threat information out there so that hopefully whoever's being targeted can help, you know, help themselves, help defend themselves. And we can harden that target. So the full extent that we've gone is establishing a threat information sharing program. And sometimes that means pushing out classified products to the whole country, to all of our field locations, having cleared industry in the area, and government partners come in every quarter for threat briefings. And then, like I said, with the FBI jointly, DoD and FBI, pushing down products, right? And these are strategic products, right? The ones I mentioned that I'm going to send to Chris and he's going to send to all of you and you're going to read and push it out to all of your friends, are strategic, right? They're not, you know, episodic, tactical. They are big picture. But I don't know if that answered your question.
I've been starting with, how do we start with, let's start with the why. And so is this, as we've been saying tonight, kind of an existential disruption to America that we know of? That we have a long-term battle of beliefs between us and competitors today. And then we need to talk through the why, the what, and then ultimately who's going to do something about it. And the who is all of us here in this room, or the who that needs to be able to bring everybody together against the problem set and the why. And to me, it's just, again, long-term beliefs that we're fighting against our competitors, but it has an existential threat to the disruption to our way of life.
Yeah, I mean, I would bring it back to what we talked about at the beginning. Somehow we have to inculcate the idea, or to bring back our competitive mindset as a nation. If you can trigger that, then all other things devolve from it. You try to figure out, okay, what does the new FFRDC look like? All the FFRDCs were really made back in the nuclear age. What about new FFRDCs that really go after the hardcore AI stuff? Do we have an AI core? How do we address the financial competition? How do we address the gray zone competition? How do we address the competition for talent? I believe if the next presidential election does not have this as an aspect of the election, that the candidates are not talking about this competition that we have to address as a nation together, then it's going to be very hard for anything that we do at the low level to get it done.
Which is precisely why our competitors are using social media and other forms of influence to divide us amongst ourselves and to polarize our debate and to make us name call one another. It is all about divide and conquer. It is all about follow the rabbit, don't look at the real problem. We are falling for the trick.
The deep fake.
Well, it's pretty obvious fake, really.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Sam Riddell, and I'm also in the Hacking for Defense problem. I have a question about the hot topic of the night, AI. So right now, a lot of AI research is done in a very open and shared environment internationally. So that's to say, if we are funding China's AI development, they're, in a way, also funding ours. We're learning from each other. So my question is there a paradigm shift happening, or do you think it'll happen in the future where necessarily, because of the strategic advantages that AI will begin to offer to nations who possess it, that nations will more closely guard their AI secrets? And if so, what does that look like? What does defending one's AI capabilities or AI development processes look like?
But,
That's a great
look,
question.
I mean, that is a very good question. And here's, in the Cold War, we'd send satellites and U-2s over the Soviet Union. We would count the number of bombers. We'd count the number of silos with ICBMs. We'd count the number of tanks and the number of airplanes. We had a very good sense of the capabilities that they were developing, and our technical intelligence would tell us how they operated, and we were able to address that. AI is largely invisible. In the military side, we may not know that a competitor has an advanced AI application until we find ourselves in a shooting fight. And we are surprised by the ability of a competitor to do autonomous operations. There's no incentive in my mind to hold back or keep secret AI applications that give you a competitive advantage. You're going to push them into the economy to gain the advantage. And so I think the economic competition in AI will be very open, the way you've described. One side will get an app, the other side will see what's happening, it will try to figure it out. It's going to be much, much more nuanced and difficult to judge on the military side.
Yeah, I think from a general statement, but from a classification standpoint, right? You're right. Most of the stuff is free and open. We are advantaged by other countries, who bring this talent to this particular discipline and space to help advance the technology, and we benefit from that. Where we have to be very careful, and I think we are for the most part, is drawing a cut line to be very clear about what's free and open and okay from a collaboration standpoint, but then, where do we draw the line from okay, we're getting to a point where we need to really be serious about protecting it. And usually it's later on in the development process or the specific application of the AI, right? Algorithms, whatever we're using, how we're using them, why we're using them in certain ways, right? That's where we typically get pretty serious about protecting that level of information.
And the data sets that go with it.
And the
right?
data sets.
Which is going to be the other critical part of how do you protect the data, because I think you're going to want to have the more data and the data sets that I can try it on is going to be really important as we develop algorithms that teach other algorithms.
Thanks. So we're going to run out of time here quickly. The last person will be the last person. No more questions. And let's try to ask the questions. And if I could gently ask our panelists to.
Well, this is a really niche and specific question. My name is Sawyer Judge. I'm not in Hacking for Defense, but I am a security studies student. And thank you all for being here. My question is about wargaming. You brought it up earlier, and it seems like it has a great potential to solve our shortage in data because it can help us create potentialities and study those. I want to know the future of wargaming in your minds. Can it help us understand the scale of this problem? How far can it go? And the second part is, if you had a team of war game designers at your fingertips tomorrow, what the ideal war game, what question it would answer for you?
It's a great question. So I don't have a team at my disposal, but I'm actually going to have a team come talk to me on Thursday with pitching an idea on how do we get after taking wargaming to the next level, because what you've hit upon is, I think, can offer us lots of insights. Part of it is I need to be able to bring in all the different aspects of it and all the different disciplines to it. I think besides Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, besides our coalition partners, how do I bring in the other government agencies to really think through the consequences of war games?
Real quickly, I think we overemphasize data right now. Eric Schmidt again says, if we thought data was the oil that generated the AI revolution, we're well past peak oil. We're going into reinforcement learning. AlphaGo Zero just played games against itself. It wasn't shown any other games that were ever played. It just was told, here are the rules, fight yourself. Fought itself 30 million times. And it crushed AlphaGo, which was based on training sets. Same thing on reinforcement learning in StarCraft 2, a really cool strategy game, real-time strategy game. Google has, I can't remember the name of the AI, but all it did is it played itself for the equivalent of 200 years. And it came back and started crushing all of the world's best players. So in wargaming, there are going to be two uses for wargaming. One I'll call Ender's Games. We're going to teach commanders how to fight in this AI-infused world by watching how a computer fights, and then it will fight the computer and the human will get better. And the second thing is it will tell us how to fight campaigns. We'll be able to put in their sensor data and our sensor data and our weapon data and our weapon data. It's all known, and then we'll allow the machine to fight itself, and it will give us ideas on how a campaign might be fought. So reinforcement learning, learning without data, I'm sorry, it's too long, but we shouldn't wait for data to get after the AI revolution. We use data, we don't have the data, so we don't do anything. We're just a bunch of lame complainers. We have to get after it. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox.
Have at it. I know you're passionate about this.
This piece is also real important. We're calling this multi-domain command and control. So how do I take, think every sensor to be able to, whether it be ground, air, space, combine that information with artificial intelligence, with a commander to make decisions faster than an adversary would.
But this is very DoD focused, and
That's
I
DoD
do think there are scenario exercises that are going to be really, really important for the nation as a whole in thinking about how to understand how an adversary moves up the threshold, because it's going to be multiple adversaries coming from multiple points that are going to sort of congeal and trigger certain responses. There's a lot of work to be done just practicing what we see and how we put the data together. And
it's going to be great in gray zone competition. It will. Right now, we could rerun the little green men problem in the Crimea, and we could have indications in warning AI that says something is happening here by looking at all of the social media, looking at all of this. There's all sorts of things we could be doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming in today. So all of the panelists have been discussing China within the context of strategic competition, and we haven't really discussed areas of potential cooperation with China. So how should the U.S. strike a balance between engaging China as a strategic partner and balancing against China as a strategic competitor?
Sounds like a state question to me.
give all the hard ones to state, but don't give us any resources. It's a great question, and I think one of the reflexive answers that I am tempted to give is, we tried that. Bob was talking earlier about how much of the orientation in the last few administrations was one of trying to essentially figure out rules of the road with China, get them vested in the international system, come up with sort of norms we could follow in areas in which there were competition, and we didn't have much luck with that approach. That's not to say it's not been episodically useful in certain areas where we wanted to see change and they needed the response that would come from change in the short term. But the long-term cooperation is going to require finding ways in which we can truly identify shared interests with China. So one example might be, because in the same way that China's looked at machine learning and AI, it's also looking at bio. One way might be to think about collaborating on global epidemic management, because China will have an interest in that. If you can find a handful of problems that you might work on. But in general, I would say the Reagan era doctrine applies, trust but verify. And we're not able to verify a whole lot with China. So we've got to continue taking a posture that thinks about the long-term both weaknesses in the United States, organizationally, politically, in terms of our orthodoxies about the private sector and the role of government, in terms of our organizational and legislative ability to craft solutions. We've got to think about those vulnerabilities. And we also have to think about sort of the core pieces that we need to protect going forward and how to continue to fuel innovation. That doesn't matter whether we're competing or cooperating with China. That's what we should be focusing on. And so quite irrespective of what potential there might exist for cooperation with China, I think the message that you're hearing here would apply to any potential competitor. And it has to do with the vulnerabilities that we see that are currently being exploited by A or B, but they're vulnerabilities that are going to be exploited by more and more people because there are vulnerabilities. And we should close those seams.
Bob.
I believe that we should not follow the Cold War model, and the United States could try to convince Russia and China that we will go to Mars together in a joint program for the betterment of mankind. And we will work together, we'll share all technology, we will get there as members of the same planet. And in my view, that is the single most attractive means that I think that we could tamp down the broader strategic competition and move towards cooperation. Whether or not we would be able to convince the Russians and the Chinese to do it is a whole other issue. But if the United States said we're willing to share all technology to do this together, I think we'd have a shot.
Thanks, man.
Hi, my name is Roland. I'm an undergrad in the School of Foreign Service, and my question I think you kind of answered my question in the previous one, but I'm just a little concerned that when you were proposing the emphasizing on the competitive mindset, that the U.S. would deliver a wrong message of not following principles anymore, but looking at the problem from a very actually Cold War mindset of whenever we mention China and Huawei as if they are definitely wrong to cooperate with. And I think there seems to me a certain danger and risk of making the question black and white, but not analyzing it from the perspective of principle and standard. So I guess I'm wondering, how would you evaluate the risk and danger there of promoting a competitive mindset to the public?
Sounds like a state question to me.
So look, why should we not protect our interests? It's important for us to protect our interests. And if we talk about ourselves and we talk about what we can do, irrespective of a particular country, then we're not doing anything that a nation would not be expected to do. If the competitors don't give voice to the same logic that we're expressing on this stage, it's not because they're not operationalizing the logic. So I think it's a question that goes both ways in the context of any bilateral relationship. I love the fact that our Defense Department wonk wants to go to the moon with China and Russia. Mars with China and Russia. Thank you. We did moon.
We're going to get to the moon first.
And Elon Musk.
Let's see what happens, right? So it will have to be a two-way. It'll have to be a two-way process.
Thank you.
Trying to say is that China might not necessarily be a black and white authoritarian opposite to the US, and I think China itself is trying to figure out what kind of system it wants as well. I've been to so many panels of involving China scholars, and I think there's a lot of internal debate in China, and if we can be more open to helping China or be open to not just asserting it as a strategic opposite, that it might be a better we might be having a better landscape to work with. There might be better result if we don't have the assumption of China as a complete authoritarian that we should not cooperate.
I think they have to prove that, though, right? We haven't seen that proof of any of that. We've seen the exact opposite of that recently.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jason.
Good evening, Commander Jason Stahl, SSP and H4D, Acting for Defense class, student. Had to write this down for myself. So we began the evening talking about Mearsheimer's definition of great power competition, and also it alluded to the China's switch to employ soft power techniques. In the past, at least from the military side of the house, I've experienced the use of special operations, cyber, and now AI as the answer to all our problems. Although they are credible enablers, we require focused strategies and implementation of these tools. Is the DoD postured to implement industrial-scale gray zone competition against China while maintaining a Mearsheimer-like definition of great power competition against Russia? And then two, because we keep alluding to the State Department, is State Department prepared to coordinate and lead that effort?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the State Department has not been a powerful coordinator of policy for some time. So this speaks to the ossification of the 1947 National Security Act and the way our bureaucracy and our budgets have evolved. So that's not to cast aspersions on anyone in the State Department or on the fact of diplomacy. It's simply to talk in frank terms about what capabilities currently exist. I think that we would need to re-envision what it means to have a strategic and operationally minded whole-of-government approach and how we would carry that out. One of the interesting things about the ways in which the Pentagon has begun to grapple with this question of the gray zone is by absorbing into it the tools to fight the gray zone, because it's so difficult for us to think about trying to imagine a new, broader approach that isn't led by the Department of Defense. But I think there's a real risk that in the absence of a broader change, DoD will accrue more and more tools and authorities to conduct this competition, and I don't think that's healthy for our form of government or for our nation.
I'll say, just to pile on there, I think the most woefully under-resourced skill set that we have in our toolkit is counterintelligence. We pivoted our counterintelligence resources after 9/11 because they also cover terrorism as under the EO 12333 definition. And we swung them heavy that way. We have not rebalanced. So in the gray zone, there are a lot of tools we have in our toolkit from a counterintelligence standpoint to operate in creative ways in that space. And I'll just say we systemically, as a department, are under-resourced. There was a study done last year on this. I think General Mattis had a plan to fix it, but there's a recognition that that is the case. Budget cycles and come and go, and I think every year we try to balance that resource. And I think now Joint Staff is leading an effort, J2 is leading an effort focused on that same discussion to get the resourcing picture back to what it needs to be, because it's one of the most critical precision tools in our toolkit in the gray zone fight.
And, at the upper level, strategic deterrence. So the strategic balance, that's focused on the Department of Defense. The conventional balance, that's focused on the Department of Defense. The day-to-day competition among great powers, which occurs in the gray zone and occurs in economics and occurs in technology, all of that shouldn't be the lead of the Department of Defense. I mean, there is just no way that the Department of Defense should focus on strategic deterrence and conventional deterrence. And I would argue strongly that we need to strengthen the Department of State and CIA, paramilitary, and do what we did in the Cold War so well, which was compete every day, year after year, decade after decade. We were darn good at it.
Thanks, Jason. Last two questions need to be quick.
Paper.
Last two questions need to be really quick.
Hi, good evening. Arthur Moore. I'm a U.S. Army National Guard officer. I liked the comment about an AI Reserve Corps, but my question has to do with something different. When the nation first started out to build out the engineering infrastructure that we needed, we established the military academy. Today, a lot of our best cyber up-and-comers are coming from the Air Force Academy and West Point, lieutenants and captains. So my question is, is there an effort to look into a new service or service-like academy for cyber and AI? And is that getting any traction?
I'm not aware of that. I know we certainly use the Air Force Academy. We've got CyberWorks and a bunch of folks focused on cyber. I think artificial intelligence, there's a little bit of it. We'll make inroads across that area over the next few years, but we're also reaching out more broadly than just the academies to how do we partner with other academic institutions, whether it be Carnegie Mellon, whether MIT, Stanford, as we develop these skill sets for AI. And then, again, what I want people to do is to join the department to come help us on some national security challenges and use the talents that they bring with them.
And one thing to know is that the Hacking for Defense course is going to be taught this summer at West Point. I hope it goes to all the service academies. I hope it spreads to all the PMEs, both civilian and officer PMEs. It's problem solving that we also need skill in, not simply knowledge of particular domains. We need to know what to do with hard problems with that domain expertise. So it will be taught at West Point this summer for 2 weeks, so we're excited about that.
Glad you're starting with the best academy.
Go Marine Corps. Okay. Last question. Andrew.
No worries, Chris. This is going to be fast. My name is Andrew Brown. I'm the lead data scientist at Govini. Really simply, this has been fantastic tonight. Thank you all for being here. And my question is there a book or something that you could suggest that we could all go home and look at and read to learn more about this from each of you, if that's okay?
A favorite book? Yeah.
I'll give one I read recently. It's kind of this innovation challenge that we all face. It's called the silo effect. So it happens in industry, it happens across us, how we have built these little silos that allow us to not be competitive. And it uses its opening chapters about Sony and how Sony kind of fell off and why, but it tells a broader story about some of the challenges that we're all going to face between industry and academia and the military to break out of our silos and be able to pull together knowledge and information if we're going to compete and win. It's called the silo effect.
I have 3 products that I'm going to send to Chris after this that I hope he pushes out to all of you. It's that suite of FBI products that I mentioned, this Deliver Uncompromised product, and then this recent Navy assessment that was pretty brutally honest about the current state of play. It's a thick read, but it's well worth it.
I think I don't have a book that stands out because there are so many different views on this, the realists, the neoconservatives. But there have been a series of speeches that have been really good. This one by Christopher Ford, Relearning a Competitive Mindset in Great Power Competition, I thought was really, really good. And there are a couple other speeches that I can send Chris's way that I think, from a wide variety, from people from state, from people in the Department of Defense, people in the Department of Commerce, and the White House, that kind of gives you the broad view.
I'm totally blanking on the name, but 8 months ago, big book came out, Superpowers and AI, right?
Oh, by Kai-Fu.
Yeah.
Kai-Fu
So
Lee, is
that's
that
a
right?
good place
Kai-Fu
to
Lee, I
start.
think. Fantastic book.
AI, yeah.
Thank you all for coming this evening. I hope you found the discussion as captivating as I did. I really want to thank Bob Work and Sarah Sewall and General Wilson and Carrie Wibben for being here. If you didn't get something out of this, a lot out of this, you weren't listening. So thanks so much. We appreciate it. And Hacking for Defense folks, you have work to do.
What's up with this Hacking for Defense? I thought it was cyber. It should be hawking for defense.
I'm going to speak to the. I'll be speaking to the people who named it about that. I also want to say.
Thank you, Chris.
Yes. Yeah, thank you
Hacking
very
for
much.
state, hawking for defense.
We do political commentary, Bob. Political commentary. Thanks so much. Have a great evening. Safe home.